Did you know that Charles Manson, the most infamous murderer in American history, never killed a single one of the people in this story with his own two hands? Not one of them. Not at the house in the hills. Not anywhere. The man whose face you picture when you hear the word evil personally murdered no one on the nights that made him famous. And almost everything you think you know about why it happened is wrong. So tonight, I'm going to tell you what they never told you. Who these people actually were. How a 5'2" ex-convict that nobody ever wanted talked a church-going girl and a former honor student into picking up a knife for him. And why, more than 50 years later, some of them are still sitting in a cell tonight, and one of them is walking free. Let's start where it ended, because that's where most people start, and almost none of them understand it. It's a warm night in August 1969. Up in Benedict Canyon, in the hills above Los Angeles, there's a house at the end of a long, private road. Inside is a 26-year-old actress named Sharon Tate. She's 8.5 months pregnant. Her husband, the film director Roman Polanski, is in Europe for work. So a few of her closest friends have stayed the night to keep her company. There's Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist who cut the hair of half of Hollywood, Abigail Folger, the heiress to a coffee fortune, and Wojciech Frykowski, a writer and Abigail's boyfriend. It's late. The house is winding down for the night. None of them know that down at the gate, a set of headlights has just gone dark. None of them know that 4 strangers are already on the property, and none of them have anything at all to do with the man who sent them. By the time the sun comes up, all 4 of those friends are dead. Sharon Tate is dead, and her son, who was just 2 weeks away from being born, never gets the chance. There's a 5th body that almost no one remembers. A teenage boy named Stephen Parent. He was 18. He'd been visiting the young man who lived in the cottage out back, the property's caretaker. Stephen was just driving back down the road to go home at the worst possible moment, when the 4 of them were driving up it. He had nothing to do with any of this either. He was simply there. Now here is the part that should stop you cold. The man who ordered all of it, Charles Manson. He is not one of those 4 people. He isn't even on the property. He's miles away, asleep at a rundown ranch in the hills. He will never touch Sharon Tate. He will never touch any of them. So how does his name become the most famous name in the entire history of American murder? That is the real story. And to understand it, you have to understand him. Which means going all the way back to the beginning, to a childhood so brutal that it almost explains him. Almost. Charles Manson was born on the 12th of November, 1934, in a hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother was a 16-year-old girl named Kathleen Maddox. On the birth certificate, in the space for his first name, it just said, "No name Maddox." She hadn't picked one yet. His father was a man who called himself Colonel Scott. That wasn't a military rank. It was just his name, which he used to seem more important than he was. He was a con artist, and the moment Kathleen told him she was pregnant, he told her he'd been called away, and he never came back. Charles Manson never met him. His own father conned his way out of the room before the boy was even born. You'll hear a lot of stories about Kathleen Maddox, that she was a prostitute, that she once sold her own son. Be careful with those. A lot of them came from Manson himself, years later, and the man was a liar down to the bone. The truth is sadder and more ordinary. She was a poor, young, alcoholic teenager who was in way over her head and who never really wanted the child she was stuck with. He told one story his whole life, that his mother took him to a cafe when he was small, and the waitress joked that she'd take the boy in exchange for a pitcher of beer. And his mother said sure, drank the beer, and walked out without him. His uncle supposedly had to track him down days later. Did it actually happen like that? Probably not. But think about this. That is the story Charles Manson chose to tell about his own mother. And that tells you exactly how unwanted he believed he was. When Charles was 4 years old, his mother and her brother robbed a man. The brother held the victim up with a bottle filled with salt, pretending it was a gun. The man fought back, so the brother smashed the bottle over his head, took $35 and the man's car. Kathleen got 5 years in prison. So at 4 years old, Charles was handed off to relatives in West Virginia. His grandmother, who was a rigid, fundamentalist churchgoer, his aunt, and his uncle, a man named Bill. And here is the first cruelty we can actually name. One day, little Charles cried in front of his first grade class. To his Uncle Bill, a boy who cried was weak, a sissy. So as punishment, his uncle made him put on a dress, his girl cousin's dress, and sent him to school in it, to toughen him up, to shame the softness out of him. Think about what that teaches a small child, that love comes with conditions, that weakness gets you humiliated, that the world will hurt you for what you feel. They would also take him, over and over again, to visit his mother inside one of the harshest prisons in the state. And every single time, the little boy came apart. When his mother finally got out, 3 years later, she gave him a hug. He would say, decades later, that this hug was the only happy memory of his entire childhood. One hug. That was the whole list. But it didn't last. She started drinking again. They moved from place to place, and by the time he was 12, she had decided she couldn't handle him, and she sent him away. Not to a relative, to an institution, a Catholic reform school for delinquent boys, where the punishment for the smallest mistake was a beating with a wooden paddle or a leather strap. He ran away. He slept in the woods, under bridges, wherever he could. He went home to his mother, and she sent him away again. The message could not have been clearer. Nobody is coming for you. Nobody wants you back. And then it got worse than beatings. He bounced through more institutions, each one harder than the last. At one point, a kind judge sent him to Boys Town, the famous home for troubled boys. He lasted 4 days before he stole a car and a gun. The next place they sent him was a reform school called the Indiana Boys School. And there, by multiple accounts, older boys raped him, while a staff member, an adult who was supposed to protect him, stood by and encouraged it. He was beaten, over and over. So let's name what was done to this child, and who did it. His father abandoned him before he was born. His mother abandoned him, again and again. His uncle humiliated him to break the softness out of him. And a system full of adults who were paid to take care of him beat him and let him be raped instead. That is a real horror. And it would be easy to stop right there and tell you the system simply created a monster. But that's not quite the truth either. And this is the part the sad version always leaves out. The people who knew him as a child said he was already a problem, already a liar, already someone who manipulated everyone around him before he was even 10 years old. Plenty of children survive things just as terrible as what happened to Charles Manson, and they grow up kind, or at least harmless. The abuse does not excuse what he became. It just helps explain where he first learned the lesson he would spend the rest of his life using on other people. That everyone has a wound. And if you can find it, you can own them. Because while all of this was happening, Charles Manson was learning. By the time he was a grown man, he had spent more than half of his entire life locked up. And here's the detail that tells you everything. When the prison system finally decided to release him in 1967, he didn't want to go. He actually asked to stay. The cage was the only home he had ever really had, but he hadn't wasted those years. While other men just did their time, Manson studied people like a science. He learned to read them, to flatter them, to find exactly what a person was missing and become it. He picked up pieces of religion, scraps of pop psychology, the manipulation tricks of pimps and con men, and he stitched them together into something he could use. He walked out of prison a small, unremarkable man, 5'2", and he had become one of the most dangerous things a damaged person can become. Patient, charming, and completely hollow inside. And in 1967, the world opened a door for him that he could never have dreamed of. He went to San Francisco, right into the middle of the summer of love. The city was flooded with young people who had run away from home. Runaways, lost kids, kids who had been hurt, kids looking for a family, a father, a God, or just one single person who would finally tell them they mattered. Charles Manson had spent more than half his life in institutions, learning exactly how to be that person. So how did he do it? How do you actually take an ordinary young woman and turn her into someone who will kill a stranger and feel good about it? It wasn't fast, and it wasn't magic. It was a method. And once you can see the steps, you can never unsee them. Step 1 was love. When he found a hurting young woman, he didn't preach at her. He adored her. He told her she was beautiful, that she was special, that she was finally home. Total acceptance, instantly, with no conditions. Today, we have a name for this: love bombing. Take Patricia Krenwinkel. She had been bullied her whole life. She had a medical condition that left her ashamed of her own body, and she had been told she was ugly since she was a little girl. And then Charlie told her she was beautiful. He was the first man who ever had. Within days, she walked away from her apartment, her car, and her last paycheck. And she followed him. He hadn't sold her a single idea yet. He had given her the one thing she had never had in her life. And once someone gives you that, they can ask you for almost anything. Step 2 was isolation. He gathered his followers, mostly young women, and he took them somewhere with no exits that mattered. An old, run-down movie ranch in the hills outside Los Angeles called Spawn Ranch. Later, a place even deeper out in the desert. Out there were no clocks, no newspapers, no families, no other voices, and no other opinions. There was one voice, and it was his, all day, every day. Step 3 was breaking down the self. He kept them awake for days at a time. He controlled all the food, which they often pulled straight out of dumpsters. And he gave them LSD again and again, while he usually stayed clearer himself. He used those hours, when their minds were wide open and defenseless, to pour himself in. He would lecture for hours, the same ideas on a loop, until they could not remember a single thought that was truly their own. He even took their names. He renamed the young women, gave them brand new identities, so that the person who had first walked in slowly stopped existing. Step 4 was sex, and he used it as a tool, not as pleasure. He decided who slept with whom. He broke up couples and bonds on purpose, so that no one in the group was loyal to anyone but him. He used sex to humiliate, to reward, and to make himself the center of absolutely everything. And then, step 5, came the belief he built on top of all of it. This is the part where he installed the off switch. He taught them there was no such thing as death, that the self was an illusion. One of his own songs was literally called "Cease to Exist," and if you truly believed there was no death and no real you, then killing a person wasn't really killing at all. It was nothing. Month after month, he quietly removed the part of their minds that screams, "No." He let them believe he was Jesus. He played with his own name, Manson, a man's son. He would hang on a wooden fence with his arms stretched out like a man on a cross. And to a sleepless kid, full of acid, who finally felt loved for the first time in her life, it was real. That is how you do it. Not with a knife, with a wound and a desert and no sleep and total love, until a person hands you their own mind. And then he gave them a mission worth killing for. He called it Helter Skelter. And here's something almost everyone gets wrong. He took those two words from a Beatles song. When the Beatles released the White Album in 1968, Manson became convinced that the band was speaking directly to him in code. He decided Helter Skelter was a prophecy. He even tied a track called Revolution 9 to chapter 9 of the book of Revelation in the Bible. In his mind, 4 young men in England were 4 angels sending him his orders. And the prophecy was this: a great race war was coming that would burn America to the ground. His family would hide deep underground, out in the desert, while it raged. And when it was over, they would climb out and rule whatever was left. It was insane. Let me be completely clear about that. But the insanity was never the point. The point was that it made Charlie the single most important person in the only story that mattered. And it handed him a button he could push any time he wanted. Because if the fate of the entire world is on the line, then a man like Manson can ask his followers to do anything at all and call it righteous. There is one more piece, and it's the part that turns this from a cult into a bloodbath. Charles Manson desperately wanted to be a rock star. He believed he was a great musician, and he had gotten close. He befriended Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, and for a while, he and his family actually lived inside Wilson's house. The Beach Boys even recorded one of Manson's songs, and he got introduced to a powerful record producer named Terry Melcher, the son of the actress Doris Day. Manson was certain that Melcher was going to make him a star. Melcher listened to him, and then he passed. He said no. So the man who had been rejected by everyone his entire life, by his father, by his mother, by every institution that ever held him, was rejected one final time. By the one door he wanted to walk through more than any other in the world. Now remember that producer, Terry Melcher, because here is the detail that ties this entire thing together. That house in Benedict Canyon, the one where Sharon Tate and her friends were staying. Terry Melcher used to live there. August 1969. Manson gives the order. He sends 4 of his followers down out of the hills to that specific house. Charles Tex Watson, his most trusted enforcer, the one who would actually hold the knife, and 3 young women, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. He tells them to go to the house and destroy everyone inside. He has his own private reason to hate that address, but the people staying there now have no connection to Terry Melcher at all. They are simply there. I am not going to take you through what happened inside that house, blow by blow. You don't need it. And Sharon Tate and her friends deserve far better than to be reduced to it. So I'll tell you only the things that matter. Sharon Tate understood what was about to happen to her. and she begged. She pleaded with them to spare her life just long enough to give birth to her son. She told them they could do anything they wanted after that. Just let her have her baby first. They refused. When they were finished, one of them used Sharon's own blood to write a single word on the front door. 5 people were dead, including a little boy who was never given the chance to be born. A name had already been chosen for him, and one of those 4, Linda Kasabian, never went inside. She stood watch out front, but she saw enough. And what she saw on that night is the only reason any of them were ever convicted. Hold on to her. She comes back. The very next night, Manson decided to come along himself and watch what he does. Even now, he doesn't do it. He picks a house in another neighborhood, almost at random. A middle-aged couple, a supermarket owner named Leno LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary. Manson walks in, ties the couple up, and then he leaves. He sends his people in to finish it, including a 19-year-old girl named Leslie Van Houten on her first and only night. More words, written in blood, on the walls. They even misspelled one of them, the war that Charlie had invented, written out in the blood of strangers by the hands of his own children. And those were not even the only people the family killed that summer. There were others. A music teacher, a ranch hand. By the time it was over, 9 people were dead. But look at the pattern, twice. On the 2 nights the whole world would remember forever, the most infamous killer in history stood right there in the room and let other people hold the knife. That was always the trick. He didn't kill people. He built people who would. What happened next changed America. These murders did something to the country's nervous system. A beautiful, pregnant young actress, slaughtered inside her own home in the Hollywood Hills, with no motive that anyone could find. People in Los Angeles started locking doors they had never locked before. They bought guns. They bought guard dogs. A lot of people will tell you the 1960s really died that summer. The whole dream of peace and love and trusting strangers. It curdled into fear almost overnight, and for months, no one knew who had done it. Here's the strange part. The family wasn't even caught for the murders first. The police rounded them up out in the desert over something completely unrelated: stolen cars. The truth only came out because one of them couldn't keep quiet. Susan Atkins, sitting in a jail cell, bragged to another inmate about killing Sharon Tate, and the other inmate went to the authorities. That's how it broke. Not brilliant detective work. A confession that one of Charlie's most loyal followers simply could not resist making. Then came the trial, and Manson ran it like a performance. He carved an X into his own forehead. And within a single day, the young women on trial beside him, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, had carved the exact same mark into theirs. Outside the courthouse, the followers who hadn't been charged set up camp on the sidewalk, shaved their heads, and waited for him there for months. Sit with that for a second. The man was locked in a cage, on trial for his own life, and he still had them, completely. That is the most frightening piece of evidence in this entire case. The prosecutor, a man named Vincent Bugliosi, understood the real problem better than anyone. Manson had not physically killed a single person in that house. So, in order to convict him of murder, Bugliosi had to prove something that had almost never been done in an American courtroom. He had to prove that a man could commit murder using nothing but his control over other people's minds. And he did it. His most important witness was Linda Kasabian, the young woman who had stood watch on the first night and who had not killed anyone. She climbed up onto that witness stand and she told the truth for 18 straight days, and she never broke. Charlie's own follower is the reason that Charlie went down. 1971. The verdict came back. Guilty. All of them. They were sentenced to death. And then came a twist that almost no one remembers. About a year later, the state of California abolished the death penalty. And in an instant, every one of those death sentences turned into life in prison. Charles Manson, who had been condemned to die, would instead go on to live for another 45 years. He never got out. He gave interviews from his cell for decades, raving, performing, because by the end, the performance was the only thing he had left. That X on his forehead eventually became a swastika. He died in 2017 at 83 years old of cancer, still behind bars. A tiny, broken man who never killed anyone with his own two hands and who ended his life as the single most recognizable face of murder in America. But what about the others? The ordinary kids that he took apart and rebuilt into weapons? They got the sentence he handed them, and most of them are paying it tonight. Susan Atkins, who bragged in that jail cell, died in prison in 2009. Charles Tex Watson, the man who actually held the knife on both nights, is still locked up, denied parole more than 18 times. Patricia Krenwinkel, the girl who had never been called beautiful until Charlie said the word, is now the longest imprisoned woman in the entire United States. A parole board has decided that she is safe to come home, and a governor keeps overruling them and saying no. And then there is Leslie Van Houten, the youngest. She was 19 years old on that one single night. After 53 years behind bars, she was finally released in 2023. The only one of Sharon Tate's and the LaBianca's killers ever to walk free. An old woman now, a woman who spent 5 decades sitting in front of parole boards, trying to explain how a teenage girl gets talked into murdering people she had never even met. And after all of that time, she still couldn't fully explain it. But here is the thing she could never quite bring herself to say. The explanation was never really the mystery, and it was never an excuse. These were not helpless puppets. They had minds of their own. They simply handed them over. Charles Manson went hunting for the weak and the lost and the lonely. The kind of people who were desperate enough to stop thinking for themselves and let someone else do it for them. And they let him in. Every single one of them had 100 chances to walk out, the way other people did walk out. They stayed. They listened. They believed. And when the night finally came and the knife was in their own hand, the choice was theirs, and they made it. And the man who hunted out that weakness and fed it and aimed it at strangers who had never done a thing to him. There is an older, uglier word for a creature like that. A monster, not a misunderstood little boy, not some sad victim of his own story. A monster who took everything that had been done to him and chose to do something far more evil to people who were completely innocent. Because do not ever lose sight of what this actually was. A 26-year-old woman, 8 months pregnant, begging for the life of the child inside her, and getting nothing. People slaughtered in their own homes for a war that never existed anywhere except inside one small, empty man's head. More than 50 years have gone by, and it should still turn your stomach. It should. He died an old man, alone in a cell, still performing for the cameras, still nothing at all. The world remembers his face. It should remember theirs instead. Sharon Tate. The friends who died beside her. The couple who never even understood why. because the real lesson here isn't some comforting little mystery. It's something far uglier. That horror this complete only needs two things to happen in this world: a monster, patient enough to build it, and minds weak enough to say yes.